What he means is that Ukraine has no intention to give up its territory. Most of the conversations around a ceasefire essentially amount to various countries of the West implying that Ukraine should cede control of Crimea and of the Donetsk region. And basically, what Zelensky is saying is that he refuses to have a stalemate where there are Russian troops on Ukrainian soil, and that's considered a ceasefire.
Well, Zoya, he says the war should be ended at the negotiating table. What would Ukraine consider a victory?
Ukraine has repeatedly said that the only way that it will consider a victory is if all Russian troops leave Ukrainian soil. There is no other alternative for the Ukrainians as far as they're concerned. Crimea is Ukraine, Donetsk is Ukraine, and no Russian troops should remain on that territory.
Well, Ukrainian forces are finding it hard to stave off attacks in the eastern city of Severodonetsk, as we've just heard. How close is Moscow to taking control of this strategically important city?
At the moment, it's reasonably disputed what's happening on the ground in Severodonetsk. It's a key city because essentially it is the remaining Ukrainian-held city in the Luhansk region, which is in Donetsk. And basically what we've heard is from the Russian side, they're claiming that they've taken all remaining civilian areas in the city and they've got only some industrial areas that are still held by Ukraine. The Ukrainians are claiming no, that they still have some of that civilian territory and that in fact they're fighting back. So it's hard to know exactly what's happening on the ground at the moment. It's the scene of extremely heavy fighting right now. So we don't know exactly what's happening. We do know that that's where some of the heaviest fighting is taking place. And certainly the Russians are aiming to take that city.
Meanwhile, Russian state media are reporting that more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers who surrendered in Mariupol have been transferred to Russia for investigation. What do we know about this?
We know that there are a lot of fighters who were holed up in the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. They were the last remaining fighters holding that city in the face of an extremely severe Russian attack. Those fighters were en masse removed from Azovstal when those soldiers ended up Ukraine had to surrender Mariupol and those fighters were taken, many of them were taken to Russia. We've seen some of the first images come out of some of those fighters who are now facing trial in Russia and who have been imprisoned in Russia. We don't know what their fate will be in the long term. We don't know what sorts of conditions they're being held in right now.
Well, the UN plans to open a corridor to restart Ukrainian grain exports, but Turkey's foreign minister says more talks are needed to make progress on this.
At the moment, there are talks that are happening that Turkey is essentially being a mediator in. So the Turks are mediating between Russia and ostensibly Ukraine, although the Ukrainians have said that they actually haven't been invited to these talks that are currently happening in the Turkish capital, Ankara. The Russian side and the Turkish side held a press conference a few hours ago in which the Turks indicated that they thought there might be some sort of mediated diplomatic solution which might see a corridor opened up that would allow Ukraine to export some of the tons and tons of grain that are currently stuck on board ships as Russia has blockaded the Black Sea ports. The problem, as the Ukrainians see it, is that they actually haven't been invited to these talks. And so there's a lot of talks happening without the Ukrainians participating in them. And what Ukraine has said is that the only kind of arrangement that it will agree to in terms of getting that grain out is some sort of arrangement that could guarantee that the Russians would not exploit, for instance, demining of the sea around Odessa, which might see Russia actually use that demined trade route to attack Odessa again or to seek to attack Odessa again. That's something that the Ukrainians are saying would not be palatable to them. So it's a very difficult situation. The Ukrainians have just today, Denis Shmyhal, the Ukrainian prime minister, has announced an update on Ukraine's agricultural situation. And he has said that while sowing has happened and around about 75% of last year's sowing has been done this year, the problem is that Ukraine just has run out of space to store its grain because of this Black Sea blockade by Russia. And so essentially the Middle East and Africa, which are very heavily reliant on Ukrainian grain, are really potentially on the brink of famine as a result of this Black Sea blockade. But there isn't a really easy solution or really an obvious solution in sight because the Ukrainians are not open to essentially to a humanitarian corridor that leaves Odessa open for attack.
And Zoya, Angela Merkel has said in her first major interview since leaving office that she has nothing to apologise for with respect to Ukraine. Can you tell us more about that?
This was an interview that Angela Merkel gave last night. It's the first major interview she has given since she retired as German Chancellor, handing over to Olaf Scholz. Angela Merkel, who was in power as Chancellor for 16 years and who oversaw some significant moments in this saga, including in 2008, vetoing Ukraine's membership prospects of NATO. She basically said, look, if I had allowed that membership application to go through and Ukraine had been given a map, which essentially would be the first step to its membership process of NATO, then Putin may have invaded sooner because he would have seen that as a declaration of war. So she has said, I've got nothing to apologize for, and essentially absolved herself of any responsibility seemingly for where we are today. Of course, some of the critics who are coming out now on Twitter and in the commentariat are saying, well, actually, Angela Merkel, you were in charge of Germany for 16 years. In the course of that 16-year period, you yourself acknowledged even in this interview last night that you knew that Putin's goal was to destroy the EU. And yet you oversaw a process where Germany became more and more reliant on Russian gas and other energy supplies and oil and so forth. So certainly there's a lot of criticism in the media right now of Angela Merkel after that interview yesterday in which she said that she had nothing to apologize for.
And lastly, Ukraine's Prime Minister has also said the World Bank has approved nearly $1.5 billion in financial support for Ukraine. What will this go towards specifically?
Much of that money will be used to pay civil servant salaries, so nurses' salaries, teachers' salaries, to ensure that some of that Ukrainian, essentially those essential services continue running. Because one of the things that's happened to Ukraine is that obviously, as a result of this war, it's not able to take as many taxes. It's not able to continue business as normal, as usual. And so it's really struggling to pay some of those civil servant salaries. And the fear, of course, is that those civil servants, if they're not being paid, are thrown into crisis, and also that you might get an increasing brain drain out of Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians have been really strong in calling for support in order to pay those civil servants' salaries. And that's what this tranche of funding from the World Bank is going towards.
Zoya Sheftalovich, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.